Yes, ma'am, we are good to go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another enriching session in this FDP, Reigniting the Research Spark. Today's resource person, we have two of them, and the first one here is Dr. George Jose, Associate Professor of Anthropology, New York University, Abu Dhabi. He has held research, teaching, and leadership positions in the academia and not-for-profit sectors. In his role as Dean of the Jyoti Dalal School of Liberal Arts, NMIMS, University Mumbai, Dr. Jose has provided academic leadership to the school and has facilitated the realization of the school's vision. He led their strategic planning and curriculum development and specified their educational objectives. George was the inaugural Program Director for Asia Society India, Program Officer with India Foundation for the Arts, Bengaluru, and he was a research fellow at Forum Transregional Studien, Berlin. Dr. Jose researches metropolitan transformation in and of contemporary South Asia. His work explores the urban periphery as a crucial, if undervalued, site for culture and politics that generates a distinctive form of urbanism, especially in the global South. George is interested in the multiple ways in which the contemporary city is imagined, produced, and consumed in its margins by its marginalized citizens. Dr. Jose is also interested in understanding the expressive registers of urban creativity in our time. While his academic work is in the cognate disciplines of anthropology and sociology, George has directed programs in the field of arts and culture for international and regional organizations. He has taught in architecture, design, and management institutes in India, while also facilitating the development of policies and strategies to manage programs in research and documentation, collaboration, and education in the arts. George maintains a strong interest in arts practice across disciplines and serves collaborative projects in an advisory capacity. On a more personal note, I have known him since our days as students of Xavier's and recall some wonderful experiences working with the Social Service League and the Dramatics Society as well. Dr. George, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you back to Xavier's for this session on interdisciplinary research in the humanities, which I'm sure will not only complement but augment the learning and ideas we derived from Dr. Shubha's session on ethnography yesterday. A reminder to all our audience, please keep your pen and paper available to take notes, because the kind of people who are coming to share things with you here, you don't easily get that from just books. They are sharing their experiences, their insights, and for today's session, maybe keep a dictionary available as well, an urban dictionary, pun intended. George, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Ruby. That was a really very generous introduction. Really, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back in Xavier's, even if only virtually. And yes, I mean, you reminded me of that time almost 3 decades ago now, yeah, when we were all there back in Xavier's. When you talked about two presenters today, I was wondering because your screen seemed to show two of me, so there's only one presentation by me. There's, as you know, there's Hansika to follow this one. But thank you very much, St. Xavier's College, all of you, for this kind introduction. I'm really happy to be back here and really sharing some thoughts on interdisciplinarity today. In the humanities and social sciences. This is really, a bunch of really work in progress thoughts. And I'm really sharing this in the spirit of a workshop, really. So none of this are really fully formed. I do not have a paper to share with you, but certainly some provocations, some prompts, some ways to really try and understand what is the problematic, as it were, of interdisciplinarity. Yeah. All right. So let me try and share the PPT such as it is with you. I've been told it's about 40. I think I might be speaking for about 40 minutes or so. Would love to have a discussion, frankly. To the extent that it's possible, I would really like this to be a conversation. So with that, let me try and go into the PowerPoint. Are you guys able to see this? Yeah, excellent. All right. So I've titled this, what's not to love about interdisciplinarity. So you can see clearly it's a partisan kind of position that I have. I clearly do think that interdisciplinarity is both not just a necessary condition, but a condition that actually allows us to do our work in the humanities and the social sciences well. And therefore, obviously, I come here to, in a sense, try and look at what interdisciplinarity has brought to the table, as it were. What are the things it has given us to think about? Yeah. All right. Now, this is a bit of a longish quote, but I thought, I wanted to try and put this as a kind of a framing or an opening to our discussions today. This is actually the introduction to a volume called An Anthropologist Among Historians by an American anthropologist by the name of Bernard Cohn. Now, Ranajit Guha, who is a historian of India, one of the key members, founder members really of the Subaltern collective. While Ranajit Guha was reflecting on the work of Bernard Cohn, and Bernard Cohn's interesting boundary crossings between anthropology and sociology, this is what he had to say. Operating in splendid isolation from each other within adjacent fields of knowledge. He's talking really about historians and anthropologists out here. This was so in spite of the fact that scholars in both disciplines, anthropology and history, were often induced by the logic of their respective crafts to overstep the boundaries. So you can see that, both historians and anthropologists did see the value in crossing over, in going across to the other home. But far from being a conscious effort at interaction, this appeared within each type of discourse as an inconsequential, if avoidable, drift towards the other, as a conventional nod of little significance, rather than a recognition of epistemological necessity. Right. So now there he is. Ranajit Guha is saying, while there has been acknowledgement of each other, while we have taken account of each other's works, we tended to not really take the idea of interdisciplinarity seriously. There wasn't a recognition of epistemological necessity, the necessity from the standpoint of knowledge, from the standpoint of producing new ways of understanding the world. It wasn't seen as an imperative. It wasn't seen as something that is absolutely necessary to what we are doing, what we are meant to do in the academia. Why is then interdisciplinarity a necessity, an epistemological necessity? We might want to pause out here and think about, why does he raise this question of the necessity of interdisciplinarity in knowledge formations, right? And this is really the question that I'd like for the next about 10 to 15 minutes to really dwell on. Why is interdisciplinarity a value? Why is it something we should return to? Now, conventionally, one of the things that, again, in the same essay, Ranajit Guha highlights, is that typically we tend to have these pendulum-like movements from unverifiable generalizations to microscopic synchronic studies. And one of the kind of issues there is really that when we are working within our own disciplines, there is a kind of what he would call a frog in the well syndrome, right? And so he's suggesting that it might be useful to look across our disciplinary anchorings, and disciplinary studies themselves are in the nature of what he calls, many of them, I mean obviously not all, but there is the danger of generalizations, there is the danger of just getting stuck in your own little corner of the world. There is also the danger of what he calls interdisciplinarity as an empty gesture. And really what he means by this is, you'll see, and I'm sure those of us in the Indian academic sector, you'll see in many presentations a section called historical context, or a section called culture and society. If it's a work on history, then there'll be a section called culture and society. Or if it's a work by a sociologist, then there is the historical context. Now that's for Ranjit Guha an empty gesture. You're nodding in the direction of other work, but you're not really taking account. You're not really engaging with the possibilities of a historical method, or you're not really engaging with the insights that sociology or anthropology may have to offer. So we have to be careful about this empty gesture idea of interdisciplinarity. Now, I'd like to shift tack a little bit, and you'll find this happening often in this presentation, because like I said, it's more in the nature of a workshop. So I'm going to be kind of throwing a series of parallel ideas, if you will, out there, which I'm hoping we can bring into conversation later on in the discussion to follow. Now, this is a work by a French painter, surrealist painter from the mid 20th century, 1929 actually. It's part of a series of paintings that René Magritte, the French painter, actually titled Treachery of Images. The Treachery of Images. And this one basically is the painting of a pipe, as you can see it, but underneath that is a sentence written in French, the translation of which is, "This is not a pipe." This is not a pipe. In other words, you cannot smoke it, right? It is a painting of a pipe, not a pipe, right? And therefore, in many ways, you'll see that for the surrealists in general, and for René Magritte in particular, they were really concerned about reality and its representation. And a lot of the time, this is what we in the academia also need to try and pay attention to. We need to look at this question about how do we represent the world in and through knowledge. What do we do within our disciplinary formations and indeed in our interdisciplinary work? How do we go about representing the world, and what indeed is that gap between reality and representation? How do we continue to be mindful of that gap? How do we take account of it? And indeed, how does interdisciplinarity give us potentially a set of resources to mind the gap, as it were, between reality and representation, between the pipe and the painting of the pipe, as it were, right? So in that same context, you'll see that this is kind of a familiar map. You think you know what you're looking at, and then again, as you might very quickly realize, by staring at this map, there is a feeling of disorientation. It is the world that you know, but it is the world upside down, right? It is the world, in a sense, oriented south, right? So this is a map of South Asia, but this is a map of South Asia produced by this wonderful organization that used to be based out of Kathmandu and now has had to move around Sri Lanka, Kathmandu, etc., about this area that we know well and that we situate ourselves in, South Asia, but India, but it is obviously the world upside down. What really can we begin to understand about reality and representation? What can we understand about knowledge formations? What can we understand about interdisciplinarity by trying to look at the relationship between a map and the territory that it is supposed to represent. So it'd be great to dwell on this map because, as you know, this is the same as this, right? This is the more conventional, the more mainstream, really the map that you and I are kind of perhaps much more familiar with. It's the kind of map that you find in atlases that school children will kind of get introduced to. But if one were to compare this map with this one, what are the kind of questions these two different pipes, as it were, or two different paintings of the same pipe, or two different maps of the same territory, or two different understandings of territory that the map is provoking us to think about? What are the kind of questions it raises, right? You will note, for instance, that this map is titled South Asia. Single word, South Asia, for instance, right? That may be something to think about. And Himal has a position on calling this South Asia single word rather than South Asia, right? Um, um, what it does, as you might notice, there's now an increasing number of scholars who are sensitizing us to the notion of what many are calling terracentrism, right? That we are centered on the land. What this map enables us to do is understand that we are part of an ocean world, the Indian Ocean world, a little more. It kind of opens out into a new way of understanding our relationship beyond land. Certainly, there is the question about national boundaries, which are so prominent in this particular map, but are not so evident in this other map. And so there are questions about methodological nationalism, right? Do we even subconsciously only begin to see ourselves within nation state and its boundaries and so on and so forth, right? And whether there are ways in which we can begin to look at what maps make possible, how they allow us to see the world, but also to point out the limits of seeing the world in a particular way. Are we only reproducing prejudices? Are we only recultivating, so to speak, or regurgitating already known ways of seeing? And is there a way in which there's a blinkered understanding of the territory that maps might produce, and whether we might begin to become more attentive to the limits of our representation, as it were, even as we begin to kind of explore new possibilities in mapping, right?
George, one moment.
Yes,
Just
yes.
there's a request that if you could talk a little bit louder to be a little clearer.
Oh, I see.
Somewhere
Okay.
I think it sounds a little soft. So that's all.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
I'll try and be a little louder. All right. So here is a quote that tries to, in some sense, address part of what I've been trying to communicate with this comparison between two maps. The map is not the territory. The word is not the thing it describes. Yeah, so the logocentrism, that in a sense, yeah, the focus on the word, we need to begin to also be attentive, begin to become aware and sensitive to. Whenever a map is confused with the territory, a semantic disturbance is set up in the organism, a cognitive dissonance, if you will. The disturbance continues until the limitation of the map is recognized. Yeah. This is a painting by a wonderful artist called Zarina Hashmi. This is another way of trying to understand our condition, our predicament, a painting titled Atlas of the World 4. a series of paintings that Zarina Hashmi produced, which is really looking at, as you might well imagine, the haunting of the partition, as it were, and the kind of consequences and costs, even as the possibilities of trying to look into the future. So you can see that between South Asia, the conventional map, and an artist representation of this, you can see our burden is really to understand whether there is a story of interdisciplinarity in these representations. What might that be? What can looked at when you look at these maps through the prism of interdisciplinarity? Where does it kind of lead us? And that's a question that I'd love to discuss with you guys at the during the Q&A. So clearly. Interdisciplinarity is obviously then about thinking across boundaries, even as we begin to kind of understand that boundaries are historical. They not just in territories and on maps, but about disciplines. So these, when did disciplinary boundaries actually begin to acquire shape and form? When did they begin to become gatekeeping functions? And who began to kind of, become, so to speak, the chowkidar of discipline, so to speak? And what does that chowkidari mean? And what has been the kind of consequences of gatekeeping, not just in territory and mapping, but also in disciplines and looking across and working across boundaries? So I'd like to kind of put out a bunch of thoughts out there. At one level, interdisciplinarity is really about humility, in that it understands and acknowledges that there are multiple pathways to knowledge. It recognizes that different paths can actually enlighten different aspects of the truth. And indeed, it might even lead us to acknowledge that there are multiple truths. So there are a bunch of things here. When we begin to understand the limits of the self, when we begin to really recognize the boundaries that we work within and where we are located and where we are anchored, it teaches us humility. The recognition that there are others in the room, the recognition that this is a shared space, the recognition that there is a collective endeavor, the recognition that we are all in it together, really is an important lesson as far as interdisciplinarity is concerned. Yeah. So it is about humility, but it is also about resistance, right? It resists the idea of homogeneity, for instance. It resists the idea of a singular version of the truth, for instance. It resists, in many ways, the imposition. It makes us aware of the politics of knowledge. It begins to kind of also make us aware of the fact that there is a debate, there is a jugalbandi, a conversation, potential collaborations, but also different kinds of positions. Okay, and how do we begin to map these multiple perspectives, different ways of understanding, and indeed the role of politics, the role of power in the making and production of knowledge itself? It is obviously about knowing your limits, even as we begin to lay down the foundations of collaborating across disciplines, right? And so like I said, these are a bunch of thoughts. We can come back to them to try and kind of weave a conversation around interdisciplinarity. But these are some of the kind of elements that make it attractive. To go back to the title of the talk, right? What's not to love about interdisciplinarity? The very nature of the humanities, since we are talking really about the humanities, there's another discussion to be had about conversations and collaborations across the sciences, the social sciences and the hard sciences, quote unquote, the physical sciences. But when we are looking at the very nature of the humanities, it is in its nature. The very nature of the humanities is to address the messy, debatable, and unquantifiable but essentially human dimensions of life. This is a scholar by the name of Jonathan Bate, where he's reflecting on the public value of the humanities. And so clearly, the push towards interdisciplinarity is also a moment of recognizing that as scholars and researchers, as academicians, we need to get our hands dirty. The world is a messy place, and so our work has to, in some sense, take account of that messiness. And there are ways in which the nature of the humanities, as it were, the nature of the knowledge that we produce in our disciplines is precisely to address that debate, that essentially human dimension that Jonathan Bate says is the precondition of life itself. A research problem in the humanities, in the social sciences, for instance, a research problem doesn't bother with the niceties of fitting itself into a disciplinary frame. So we should acknowledge that a research problem is not really the same as saying this is a problem only to be understood exclusively as a historical problem or an economic problem or a problem within political science, right? The research problem really reflects the messiness of the real world, okay? And therefore, we need to understand that if we have to be equal to the idea of the research problem, then it does mean that we need to go beyond our own anchor, as it were, in a particular disciplinary frame. Equally and conversely, we shouldn't shoehorn research problems into a disciplinary pigeonhole, right? I mean, so we need to kind of understand the independence, the autonomy of the research problem. The research problem is not there to serve our disciplinary egos, so to speak, right? And research problems are never secondary to the boundaries or limits of disciplines. Disciplines really need to understand how they can begin to approach the problem of research, the research problem itself, right? And so here's where I think interdisciplinarity becomes almost an imperative condition. It is really necessary to do the practice of research, to actually engage in the messy problems of producing new knowledge. We need to kind of really realize that research problems are independent of disciplinary formations. And therefore, for instance, where I am located, my own training is in anthropology. I studied sociology growing up, and as you know, in India, which is where I got my training, anthropology and sociology, for instance, are cognate disciplines. You know, I mean, it really came as something of a surprise to me when I began to become more acquainted with, for instance, the North American context, where anthropology and sociology are very different disciplines, where it's very difficult to actually talk across those disciplinary boundaries. Sociology is much more severely a quantitative discipline, for instance. Anthropology tends to be seen as a soft discipline in comparison because it's not dealing with big data, it is not dealing with graphs and statistics, but really is about description, it's about qualitative methods, and there is obviously a kind of a hierarchy between quantitative and qualitative methods. So those are the kind of debates that I think interdisciplinary understandings and the promise of interdisciplinarity is to really go beyond some of these petty kind of battles that we tend to kind of preoccupy ourselves with when we are guarding disciplinary boundaries, right? So field work, for instance, and the archive. So while as an anthropologist, and again to go back to the Bani Kohn, reading that we began this presentation with, Ranajit Guha and Bani Kohn, you can see that part of the burden of what Ranajit Guha wants to suggest in that wonderful, very fine introduction to the work of Bernard Cohn is the necessity to bring together the work in the archive and the work in the field. The field work of the anthropologist and the historian's presence and labor in the archive, in a sense, are mutually enriching. Okay, it really kind of is something that really enables the production of new insights, of innovative knowledge. And therefore, interdisciplinarity, like as you might have guessed, the tenor of this talk is an imperative, is a necessary condition in the work that we do. Yeah. Now, while I'm talking about interdisciplinarity, the interesting thing is also to look back at the history of disciplines and my own disciplines. For instance, the disciplines that I'm familiar with, they all, broadly speaking, 19th century European origins. Western Europe really was the center of a lot of that production of those disciplines immediately following the age of the Enlightenment and so on. But if you actually look at some of the key researchers, some of the founding figures of our disciplines, for instance, in my own discipline, Max Weber or Karl Marx, hard to really pigeonhole them as exclusively sociologists. I mean, who would dare to try and kind of look at Marx and say, here is a sociologist? Historians have read him with great value and learned a lot from him. Economists obviously claim him to be their own. Political scientists cannot do their work without reading Marx. So you can see that when we are true and honest to our research problem, then we are already within a interdisciplinary formation. We are already kind of working in so to speak, a context that is in the first instance and from the get-go interdisciplinary. So you can see that the important works of our time, and not just in the 19th century, but the kind of, I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of James Scott, among contemporary social scientists, or Partha Chatterjee, for instance. Hard to kind of pigeonhole them as either historians or political scientists, which may have been their initial kind of context of study and training. But clearly they have kind of spent a long time in the houses of other people's, other disciplines, right? So researchers are and never have been disciplinary. And therefore, one of the kind of questions that we need to kind of ask ourselves is whether there is something Eurocentric about these disciplines themselves. Was it to do with that particular period in 19th century Europe, and therefore a certain kind of understanding of the world that emerged in that particular place that then began to define what a discipline is? And all of us now have a responsibility to A, recognize the inherent Eurocentrism of disciplines, but B, also, as Dipesh Chakrabarti in that wonderful phrase suggested, we need to provincialize Europe. We need to, in a sense, also make these disciplines our own by pointing to and acknowledging the limits of Europe, by understanding that there are ways of approaching the disciplines themselves that would kind of, in a sense, recast disciplines and their understanding. So it's an important, I think, to be practicing the social sciences, to be working in the humanities, to consider oneself part of this endeavor called the human sciences today, requires us to acknowledge the idea of Eurocentrism, requires us to ask whether the empire can write back, so to speak, whether the ways in which the kind of legacies of Macaulay, for instance, for those of us in India, and the other kinds of legacies are to be taken account of, and how by in and through our own work we begin to kind of move beyond and critique even the kind of inheritances that we have inherited. There's also, therefore, the decolonial imperative, very much of a piece about Eurocentrism is the need to look at our own disciplines and to see whether they have a compact with colonialism, as it were. In my own discipline, anthropology, of course, it's blatant, it's apparent, it's clearly a colonial discipline, and therefore anthropology has had to do a lot of work to first begin to acknowledge the colonial perspectives that it was a medium for, and then to begin to build a decolonial anthropology, as it were, an anthropology for our moment. And all of us working in the humanities today have this responsibility. When we teach Shakespeare, for instance, and there have been wonderful texts of decolonizing Shakespeare, and in the same way that we kind of decolonize Shakespeare, we need to decolonize our own understandings of the city, for instance, which is my own work, or for instance, begin to really understand how terms like culture, cultural difference, were really European, Eurocentric in character, content, and indeed in form. Right? So there is a very important decolonial imperative to interdisciplinarity in the practice of interdisciplinarity today. So broadly, I mean, you can see, I'm going to rush through this bit now. Let me just try and, Ruby, how are we doing for time?
It's about 3:40. So I would say we have about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can have still another 10 minutes of discussion if you like. It's up to you.
All right, okay. So then I'm
We
going to
should
rush.
end the
Yeah.
discussion also by 4:15, yeah, so that
Okay.
we get a little bit of time before the next speaker maybe.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I'm going to rush through this bit. I think this middle section, as it were, this middle passage, are things that in a sense are quite obvious. So you can see that a discipline like literature, 19th century discipline like literature, kind of evolved into comparative literature in the early 20th century, and then again kind of evolved into cultural studies. So you can map, for instance, the move towards interdisciplinarity in the way that new discipline and new disciplinary formations began to also emerge. So you can see that from the 19th century to the 20th century, a rash of new disciplines began to emerge. For instance, right, these kind of formations, right, these are all interdisciplinary from the get-go, supposedly. They are all a way of trying to talk back to the limits of 19th century disciplinary formations, yeah, sociology, anthropology, literature. Instead of that, you have urban studies, media and communication studies, development studies, environment studies, women studies. Now, what does this mean? Okay, and there's an entire story to be told about that transition and indeed that genealogy, that particular intellectual trajectory. Yeah. There's also the question about where does interdisciplinarity feature in that debate between practice and studies. So film studies versus filmmaking. Okay, and there have been wonderful kind of moments where the two have really come together. Say, for instance, the cahiers de cinema critics, film critics like Jean-Luc Godard, for instance, started off as a film critic, ended up as a filmmaker. So you begin as a scholar, but you become a practitioner, if indeed those two kind of boundaries are strict. But the promise of interdisciplinarity is again to be able to cross those boundaries between practice and studies, between being a critic and becoming a practitioner, between, so to speak, so there's obviously common sense kind of understanding, those who can't teach, those kind of ideas. Clearly interdisciplinarity is an attempt to try and engage those ideas in different sort of ways, right? These are a bunch of verses actually that I've just taken up from I don't know if you might recognize these verses. This is this wonderful poet Agha Shahid Ali, a poem of his called Farewell. And really the key terms there is memory and history. And really again here, there's something about interdisciplinarity when we think about the relationship between memory and history. My memory is again in the way of your history. I'm going to, like I said, it's available online, this particular poem, Farewell by Agha Shahid Ali. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to be dwelling on it. Your history gets in the way of my memory. Your history gets in the way of my memory. And so what is the kind of the responsibility of an interdisciplinary practice? What is the responsibility of a scholar who wants to engage with and wants to acknowledge that there are both the demands of history, the rigors of scholarship, but there's also the imperative of memory. And what happens when these two have an uneasy relationship with each other? My memory keeps getting in the way of your history. Yeah. So these are issues really that I think are challenges as far as interdisciplinary work in the 21st century are concerned, right? I'm just going to quickly play you a couple of minutes, the introductory sequence of a film called Night and Fog by Alain René. This is a film made to remind us about the Holocaust. There was rigorous research over almost 3 years that went into looking at the concentration camps before René began actually filming this. But you can see that there's a poetry to the form. There is a concern about how to remain true to the facts, but also what are the expressive registers that you can utilize as a scholar. René was very concerned that he is making beautiful something that is and should remain horrific. So what is that relationship between beauty and truth? Can one actually kind of remain responsible to both? And really, when making a film on the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, it really brings to the fore the really hard kind of requirement that all scholars have to face up. This need to be both beautiful and truthful at the same time. And what kind of demands, what kind of challenges does that kind of a requirement place on our scholars, and what can interdisciplinarity teach us about meeting that challenge?
Même un paysage tranquille, même une prairie avec des vols de corbeaux, des moissons et des feux d'herbe. Même une route où passent des voitures, des paysans, des couples, même un village pour vacances, avec une foire et un clocher peuvent conduire tout simplement à un camp de concentration. Le Struthof, Oranienburg, Auschwitz, Neuengamme, Belsen, Ravensbrück, Dachau furent des noms comme les autres sur les cartes et les guides. Le sang a caillé, les bouches se sont tues. Les blocs ne sont plus visités que par une caméra. Une drôle d'herbe a poussé et recouvert la terre usée par le piétinement des concentrationnaires. Le courant ne passe plus dans les fils électriques, plus aucun pas que le nôtre. « 1933. La machine se met en marche. Il faut une nation sans fausses notes. Sans querelle, on se met au travail. Un camp de concentration se construit comme un stade ou un grand hôtel, avec des entrepreneurs, des devis, de la concurrence, sans doute des pots de vin. Pas de style imposé, c'est laissé à l'imagination. Style alpin, style garage, style japonais, sans style. Les architectes inventent calmement ces porches destinés à n'être franchis qu'une seule fois. Pendant ce temps, Burger, ouvrier allemand, Stern, étudiant juif d'Amsterdam, Schmulski, marchand de Cracovie, Annette, lycéenne de Bordeaux, vivent leur vie de tous les jours sans savoir qu'ils ont déjà à 1000 kilomètres de chez eux une place assignée. Et le jour vient où leurs blocs sont terminés, où il ne manque plus qu'eux. Raflés de Varsovie.
All right, okay. For those of you who are interested in the film, of course, you know, the entire film, it's about 40 minutes in duration. The film is available on the internet, and you know, it's been acknowledged as one of the big achievements of the 20th century. So for those of you all who are interested, the film is available. I wanted to basically you know, draw your attention to the fact that the filmmaker here is clearly interested in giving us, quote unquote, the facts of a particularly horrific moment in global history, but he is also looking to a poetic rendition of it. And the question that I want to put to you is, what do we gain with this kind of an astonishingly poetic commentary, for instance, you know, part of a way of understanding a brutal reality, a brutal kind of chapter in our collective lives, and what is the place of different ways of approaching the same work. So as you know, it begins in color and then goes into found footage that it kind of takes up, and there's a lot of the footage that it uses, and you'll see that it gleans a variety of this kind of footage to piece together a real-time contemporary message on a particular moment in history. And so this approach to me is obviously emblematic of an interdisciplinary approach in many ways, right? You are being attentive to history, but you are being attentive to facts, but you also know the possibilities of the form, what film can do, what is film language, you know, and how do we begin to actually, in the hands of somebody who knows what that language means, what is the place of music, for instance, how does one construct a soundtrack when trying to look at particular black and white photographs. These can begin to animate our understanding of the world in new and startlingly surprising new ways. Yeah, so you know, what I'm going to do is probably stop there. There were a couple of other kind of you know, episodes or vignettes that I wanted to share with you, but I think it's more important to try and get a conversation going, and if we have some time we can come back to this, but really I think for me these issues that I talked about really help to build a kind of an understanding of what is the promise of interdisciplinarity in the humanities and social sciences, and would love to kind of have a conversation around that. Yeah. So thank you for listening, and let me stop here for now.
Thank you so much, George. We will see if some questions come up from the chat as well, because it's something that they need to think about and process as well. And in the meantime, quite a couple of, let's say, couple of ideas had come to mind as well. So from an educator's perspective, maybe I can begin the discussion that if we would want to train students to have this kind of an interdisciplinary approach or idea, without keeping it such that they are just consumers and want to get credits here, credits there, but instead try and understand the depth as well. It's difficult to do, but any ideas that you have that might help us here as well, because then we could start at an UG level, and then when they specialize at a PG level, they've already got it, that it's not just one kind of discipline that I need to master. Even if I've mastered one, I still have to collaborate or reach out beyond. That's the aim.
That's actually a great question, Ruby, and really very, very important kind of concern when one is thinking about interdisciplinarity, right? What comes first? You know, should we begin by training our students in particular disciplines, give them a strong foundation in that, and once they know where their home is, once they know what their anchor is, then they can go out to sail when they grow up, right? But to kind of give them that strong foundation, that kind of an idea. And let me actually just go back to my PPT. Can you see this? So this was actually this was actually one of the slides that I didn't come to. This idea of missing the wood for the trees, for instance. What is the big picture, the bird's eye view versus the worm's eye view? And would one say that disciplinary location is a worm's eye view and interdisciplinarity is the bird's eye view? I think there are ways of approaching this. My own sense is that we need to get out of this idea that interdisciplinarity and disciplinarity are polar opposites. My sense is when we begin to actually read, the specialists in our disciplines, for instance, we'll see that they are already interdisciplinary in their works, and so how to make students sensitive to, let us say, for instance, Sigmund Freud, right? Most of us read Freud as part of the discipline of psychology. We think that he belongs there, that he is almost a prisoner of that particular prison house called psychology. But it's astonishing the kind of insights he can provide to a practitioner of cultural difference, right? He has a lot to say about culture. But we think about culture as something the anthropologists do, and the subconscious and the unconscious as something that the psychologists do. And we realize that that's for me, that's probably the kind of 20th century understanding of the relationship between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity that we need to move away from. I think that disciplines and their best practitioners have from the beginning, from the get-go, been interdisciplinary. And we need to begin to develop that kind of an approach, a pathway in our students, in our classrooms. I don't know if that helps.
No, it helps, yes. Another area, just to strike up our conversation, is you mentioned a kind of a hierarchy of disciplines. I was just wondering, do you want to throw some light on what contributes to that hierarchy? You mentioned one comment about hard kind of quantitative data between the sociology and the anthropology, but there are, I would assume, you don't want to venture too much into certain disciplines because they won't be necessarily, or the work that comes from that may not be respected. So I'm not sure whether you'd like to shed light on this, and I know that your position would be to challenge that. So, yeah.
I mean, another great question, right, Ruby? I mean, and really the issue is you can see the kind of problem when we look at in the real world, the kind of challenges we are facing as a result of fake news, for instance, right? Yeah. A lot of us in the academia are finding ourselves bereft of resources. We really we really are finding it difficult to harness the kind of resources to address this idea that, oh, if you have this version of the truth, then I have this, and we realize that this is the kind of underbelly of that particular set of hierarchizing disciplines. By our we spend most of the 20th century trying to suggest that the STEM disciplines, for instance, are much stronger foundation. They are much more clear about their place in the world, and that we tend to value them more than, so to speak, quote unquote, the interpretative sciences, the humanities, the ones that are quote unquote soft. But you can see that in the early 21st century, much of our problems have to do with our inability to understand the role of interpretation, our inability to be able to not look at the facts, but to look at the organization of facts. Facts in and of themselves, they don't tell a story. Facts need a narrative. facts need to be cohered together to be able to animate them, to make them come alive. And you can see that there are multiple, in fact, contradictory stories being told with using the same facts. And this is because science drew a hard line between meaning and interpretation on the one hand and facts on the other. We need to acknowledge, and in fact, interdisciplinarity alerts us to the fact that there is no such distinction between facts and meaning in the way that 20th century science, in a sense, kind of seemed to suggest. Yeah? And by that, I don't mean to kind of, undermine science, because, within science, there's been a healthy kind of debate around this, right? But the way in which we caricature the idea of science, I think that has brought us to this very, very difficult juncture in our collective lives.
True, true. Another thought that had come up since we've been having talks over the past couple of days. One of the sessions was on quantitative and qualitative research. And I was wondering whether you had a comment on this. But typically when people take up one kind of methodology and they have a theory and so on, and they're looking for certain results, let's assume quantitative, culture sort of becomes like a nuisance kind of variable. It's something that you can't easily quantify, and it is you can't come to clear results because, well, you haven't acknowledged that culture is right there. As far as you can, many people try to avoid it, whereas a position like yours might be zeroing in on that but using a different, well, methodology. So I just was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that. You had said earlier at some point that ethnography is one of your passions as well.
Yeah, no, again, the issue with culture is, of course, that that everybody seems to have it. Okay, there's this idea that all societies and all people seem to have it. Okay, but at the same time, it's very different. What they seem to have is very different. Okay, so it's this kind of it's this scenario of it is the same, but very different.
Like the Indian, you're an Indian, I'm an Indian, and yet we're so different, right?
Exactly, right? So there becomes then unavoidably a contest. Okay, we begin to actually debate what really is Indian, and then of course there are, as we now very well know, there are competing definitions of what it means to be Indian, and in fact some definitions that cancel out the other definitions. In fact, as you know, there's now this kind of phrase going around called cancel culture, right? My definition of India, is under threat from your definitions of India, that we cannot even coexist, that we cannot even kind of begin to, it is precisely because we are similar that the differences begin to matter, so to speak, right? And then the differences begin to be the kind of space in which you begin to, kind of, bring all the facts to your side of the table, so to speak. Our problem, like I said earlier, our problem is because we've considered knowledge to be culture neutral. Okay, we've kind of always understood that, and this is the kind of problem with universals, right? We tend to think that if knowledge has to be scientific, then we shouldn't allow culture to taint it. We shouldn't allow the taint of culture, so to speak. And we can today see the limits of that kind of way of thinking, right? I mean, and therefore, but at the same time, I'm not suggesting that everything is relative, but what I am saying is that we need to really attend to the task of building resources that can acknowledge that there's competing definitions of culture, competing values that we have in mind when we think about difference, and we need to kind of be able to develop a coherent conversation across real differences, and that is the task of in a sense of all scholarship. And certainly interdisciplinary ways of working might help us, might contribute resources that will enable us to address this challenge. It is clearly a challenge in our times and of our times, if I might say.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Yes. A coherent conversation across very real differences. Yes. It's about 4 o'clock now, and I would suggest if there's anything that you'd like to sum up or maybe wind us with or leave us with a couple of pointers, then we could take that and then we could end for this part of the session. Yeah, is there?
No, just to go back to actually Ruby, the questions that you asked. I think there were all three of them wonderful questions, and I think what it really reminds me of is the need to develop a kind of a critical distance between ourselves as researchers and that which we want to study. And one of the dangers of disciplinary anchoring is that we tend to take for granted our understanding of what we want to look at. And one of the kind of uh, positives of interdisciplinary thinking is that it really enables us to build a certain kind of critical distance. Okay, we tend to look at this the thing from the point of view of the way others would look at it, and so to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, to actually look at the shoes of another disciplinary colleague, from across the boundary. That will help us understand our research problem differently. It
Sort
allows
of
us to kind of
like an empathy, but disciplinary empathy, right?
exactly, and that's very well put. And so, with that empathetic understanding, we are also, in a sense, broadening our capacity to interpret the world. We are actually equipping ourselves to make new meaning around the same things, that we study. So these are the possibilities that, in a sense, a interdisciplinary approach can actually sensitize us to.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruby.
I will now request one of our colleagues here to probably give us a vote of thanks. I think Vidita is here and she can unmute and go ahead and give us. I think we'll also take a bit of a break since we have that luxury at the moment today. We don't have it every day. But we'll take a 10-minute break and maybe come back by about 4:20 for the 4:30 after this. Yeah? Yes. Go ahead, Vidita.
Am I audible?
Yes, but we can't see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So we are fortunate to have had you as our resource person for the session on interdisciplinary research in the humanities. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to you on behalf of our college and the participants for taking us through this journey in such a simple and intrigued manner. Some of the points that you mentioned, like the interdisciplinarity as an empty gesture, or even the painting by the pen artist, concepts of recognition and shared space were indeed very insightful and definitely helped us gain more depth into the topic and opened ways for new perspectives in terms of interdisciplinary research. Also true to our theme of the faculty development program, which is reigniting the research spark, exploring new methodologies and perspectives. Also, not to forget the relatable examples of Marx and Weber, or even the quotes or the poem, or looking at Freud's work from a cultural perspective. I'm sure our participants across the country have benefited and learned a lot through your highly engaging and thought-provoking session. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vidita. I mean, it's a real privilege to know that you've listened so carefully to what I had to say, and that is, of course, what are the real kind of fruits of our labor, so to speak. So thank you very much. Thank you. Was happy to be here, and thank you, Ruby, for this invitation. Really enjoyed being here, and all the very best for the rest of your program.
Thank you so much. Brother Vivian, we can take a bit of a break and resume again at 4:20.
Okay, ma'am.
Somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay in a world outside so differently. Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To walk over rough roads, to open our minds, to ask the right questions and answers to find. Even though we stand alone, we know that we have grown. All because you've shown skies beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay in a world outside so differently. Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To reach out believing, to love is to share, in giving, receiving, learning to care. To a world that's one big surprise, we live and we learn to rise from valley to lofty skies, up, up, beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay in a world outside so differently. Saviors, you helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay in a world outside so differently. Saviors, you helped me become more me.
Fly like an eagle, discover new skies. With wings we've been given to soar ever high. Over mountain and ocean beach, learning from what they teach, believing that we can reach way beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay in a world outside so differently. Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To walk over rough roads, to open
roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To reach out believing, to love is to share. In giving, receiving, learning to care. To a world that's one big surprise, we live and we learn to rise from valley to lofty skies, up, up, beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
Fly like an eagle, discover new skies. With wings we've been given to soar ever high. Over mountain and ocean beach, learning from what they teach, believing that we can reach way beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To walk over rough roads, to open our minds, to ask the right questions and answers to find. Even though we stand alone, we know that we have grown, all because you've shown skies beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors,
share, in giving, receiving, learning to care, to a world that's one big surprise. We live and we learn to rise from valley to lofty skies, up, up, beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. You helped me become more me. Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
Fly like an eagle, discover new skies. With wings we've been given to soar ever high. Over mountain and ocean beach, learning from what they teach, believing that we can reach way beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To walk over rough roads, to open our minds, to ask the right questions and answers to find. Even though we stand alone, we know that we have grown, all because you've shown skies beyond.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you helped me become more me.
To reach out believing, to love is to share, in giving, receiving, love.
Saviors, you gave me roots and wings. Saviors, open my eyes to things. Saviors, somewhere along the way, you taught me how to fly and how to stay. In a world outside so differently, Saviors, you help me become more me. You help me become more me. You help me become more me.
I think it's 4:25, so maybe we could get started on the next part of our session. Welcome back to all our participants. We hope you had a refreshing break, and we now have our second speaker here. We're very happy to have her here with us. It is a moment of genuine pleasure and pride to introduce one more alumnus of our college, Dr. Hansika Kapoor. She is a research author at the Department of Psychology, Monk Prayogshala. She holds a PhD from IIT Bombay in, and this is her topic, negative creativity, also known as how people get good ideas to do bad things. But of course, today she's going to be giving us a lot of good ideas to do good research. She is the recipient of the Fulbright Nehru Postdoctoral Research Fellowship 2019-2020 and is an affiliate at the University of Connecticut. She's a published author, practicing psychologist, and visiting adjunct faculty at several liberal art colleges in India. Her research interests lie in individual differences, creativity, and behavioral science. I remember Hansika, even as a student in FYBA, presenting a paper at our Khandala seminar on creativity and doing such a wonderful job of it, even at that time, which is over a decade ago. Those were her roots, and true to our college motto, she has spread her wings and reached great heights. She's a very well-respected research author with over 40 publications and has made an impact in generating good quality Indian research and in training others as well. She's found the time to help us with syllabus framing in our college and has also been a resource person for our own students who need to learn about ethics and research report writing. Let us welcome one of the most meticulous, professional, and innovative researchers that I know to share her insights on writing a research and grant proposal. Dr. Hansika, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Ruby ma'am. It is an honor, as usual, to be back at Xavier's, teaching at Xavier's, albeit virtually. But I think I'm very, very glad that we were able to make this time and find a suitable topic that I could instruct in. And kudos to Xavier's, as usual, for spearheading igniting the research spark amongst not just students, but also professors and colleagues. Also, thank you so much for that embarrassing introduction, ma'am. I'm here to give an hour-long talk on writing a research and grant proposal. And I would love if there is some kind of interaction towards the end in terms of questions, because I know that as professors, your primary role is, well, teaching, and obviously a lot of your time goes into instruction and into planning instruction as well as into assessments, and it's very difficult to carve out time for research. But hopefully what I will be talking about today will at least build that level of motivation a little bit in terms of say better time management at least. This is an overview of my talk. I will be beginning with why a research proposal is important. Also the difference between a research proposal and a research paper. Some of the sources of research ideas, which honestly is one of the most daunting areas, not just for students, but for anyone who is entering the research domain. Where do I get an idea from? Is my idea good enough? Has someone else already done it before? And then what are some general criteria for evaluating research ideas, about knowing which idea to pursue, and kind of generating a bunch of ideas and then selecting and evaluating the best ones. Common misconceptions also would be addressed, and then I would move into the more practical part of the talk, which is the actual structure of a research proposal, what goes where, what is supposed to go where in your research proposal, followed by some more nuances associated with a grant proposal. So such as preparing a budget, applying to funders. I know that as a college, you would, as college professors, you would be eligible to apply for certain UGC major and minor grants. And I would be talking a little bit about how we can go about doing that as well. So beginning with the importance of writing a research proposal, I think it's important to begin at the very start. What is it? It's a blueprint, it's a guide, it's a framework. And in many cases, it is what your future research paper is going to be built on. So a research proposal is very foundational to your entire research trajectory and journey of your study. I'm not necessarily talking about of yourself as a researcher. So say, for instance, you want to embark on a research project that involves collecting data through interviews, for instance. You would need a research proposal right at the get-go that outlines certain core areas, core aspects about why you're doing the research, why is it important to do the research right now, how are you going to be conducting the interviews, are you trained in conducting the interviews, etc. So a research proposal helps you know what you know, and more importantly, helps you know what you don't. And I think that's the more crucial part of writing a research proposal, because sometimes you have really grand ideas, but may not have the implementation skills, and therefore may need to collaborate with someone who does. So, for instance, starting out, I've loved statistics, honestly, all my life, but at some point in time, there was a research study that I needed to possibly look at getting or collaborating with a research statistician, because I didn't know how to do certain things. And that would only come up, that kind of gap would only come up when you're starting to write the research proposal. So it is a guide, it is a blueprint, it is a framework, it is version 0.0 of your research paper, what will eventually become your research paper. Why do you need a research proposal? I think if I've not argued for why you need a research proposal yet, I haven't done a good job. But you basically need it so that you have a frame of reference to go back to once you've started doing your research in that particular area or topic. In some cases, you also will need a research proposal, or rather in most cases with human participants research, you will need a research proposal to apply for ethical approval. So oftentimes, if you've ever applied for, say, an ethics approval, you would see that like an IRB or an institutional review board form is very, like the topics in that are very similar to the topics that are there in a research proposal. And the idea is to make sure that your research proposal not just helps identify the methodology as well as the research questions, as well as the rationale for why you want to do the research, but also takes into account whether you are doing that research abiding by certain ethical codes of human participant research. You can use this proposal if you have to apply for higher educational programs. So sometimes applications for PhD programs require you to put down a research proposal, submit that. As I said, the APA ethics code or other ethical concerns, ethical principles, or IRB approval does require a research proposal as well. More recently, the trend, or which I hope is becoming the norm, of pre-registering your research also requires a research proposal. In short, pre-registration means you writing the research proposal, but also making it public, including your hypotheses, your data analysis plan, your sample selection, your sample strategy, all of it, making it as transparent as possible, putting it up on an online network such as the Open Science Framework, so that everybody can see that whatever you said in your research proposal is what you're going to do in your research paper as well. It's part of the movement of open science. It's part of the movement of basically having more transparent science, so that you don't do your analysis and say that, oh, I was actually looking for the effect in the left tail and not the right tail, and just flip the t-test values in that sense. So it's a good practice. I hope it is a trend right now. I hope it becomes the norm. It is also used, as I said, as a motivational tool to kind of motivate yourself to say that, okay, I think I can do this research. I just need to get all of these chunks in place. It can be an exercise in thought. And of course, the research proposal is a large chunk of your grant proposal. The grant proposal adds in other things like budget and timelines, but the real meat of it is still in the research proposal. It's also important when you are collaborating with other researchers, so not just within your own university or institutional setting, but also across. And there are very standard formats for a research proposal, which means that they will, whether you're writing a research proposal here according to a format that I described to you, or you're doing it in the US or in the UK, they have certain structures, they have certain components, so to speak, that will be consistent across, and therefore collaborations can become easier. It also obviously communicates your intention and your plan. At some level, it can also help convince your audience, whether that audience is a PhD advisor or a funder. And as I said, it encourages transparency, because what you put down in your research proposal is, well, you don't change that. And you don't change that after your data collection and, well, change hypothesis, etc. So it improves the quality of research that you're conducting. The research proposal is also sometimes, I mean, as a grant proposal, is sometimes used as a contract between the researcher themselves and a potential funding source. Because if a funder is providing you money to do research in a particular area or a particular topic, then a research proposal is going to list down, say, in very service terms, the deliverables of your research. So it's going to list down what you're going to come out with. Are you going to come out with a policy brief? Are you going to come out with a manuscript? Are you going to come out with a working paper, etc., etc.? And of course, it is a plan for carrying out the research. So coming to the difference between a research proposal and a research paper, one of the major differences is in verb tense. So a paper has been, you've already done the research, but a proposal will be. It is what you are proposing to do in the future. In terms of data analysis, in your proposal, there's not going to really, you're not going to do any inferential tests, so you're not really going to run a content analysis or a thematic analysis on your qualitative data. But in your proposal, you're going to propose what the analysis is going to be. So the title, instead of results, is going to be proposed analysis. And you're going to list down a very detailed plan about how you intend to go about, if you have hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, if you have research questions, answering those research questions in a very one-to-one corresponding way. In terms of brevity, a research paper is actually briefer than a proposal. And this is primarily because within academia, there are very strict word counts for final manuscripts that are published. And therefore, you can put in a lot of information in your proposal and write a literature, like a really nice long literature review in your proposal. And most likely 20% of that is going to go into your paper. But I mean, it still gives you context for motivating your research in your proposal, which is absolutely fine. And as you can understand, the depth and breadth of certain sections are going to change based on whether you will be conducting the research versus whether you have conducted the research. So that's primarily the difference between a paper and a proposal. And moving on to sources of research ideas. There can be several. let me be blunt about that. There can also be several ways to plagiarize, but my talk is not a negative creativity today. So the first place that you look for research ideas is theory. What does the theory say? What are there gaps in the theory that you have been able to spot, or are there theoretical inconsistencies in your field that therefore motivate you to conduct research to bridge that gap? For instance, in terms of my own PhD topic, as well as like continuing research in negative creativity, that was a definitional gap that was located. So the definition of creativity assumed creativity to be positive. However, there are obviously several instances that you can think of and that I can think of where someone has been harmed, but in a creative way. So you can think of like the Bollywood movie Special 26, Special 26, where a very innovative con was done, but at the end of the day, it was still a con. Or you can think of, say, The Prestige, or you can think of several other examples in movies. So the source of a research idea can be from theory. It can be, of course, from literature. And oftentimes it's from two opposing sides of literature, because everybody does so much research, in most cases in a field or in a domain, that oftentimes because social sciences are not perfect, and there is no overarching theory of human behavior, like there are laws of, well, gravity, as a result of which different findings from different regions of the world may not coincide necessarily. So literature, especially in the social sciences, can be a great source of research ideas. Replication and extension are also becoming pretty prominent, at least in the social sciences again, primarily because there are no universal laws of human behavior, as a result of which culture and the effect of context on behavior or attitudes or knowledge is coming into play in a big way. And researchers, both from the West and across the world, are now beginning to understand why it is important to consider extending and replicating, say, findings from weird nations. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Weird nations, stereotypically the US, and non-weird nations like India. So we want to try and replicate and extend findings from weird nations to non-weird locations. And another source of research idea is actually your own personal interests and strengths. It's very important as a researcher to be comfortable doing the research that you want to do. So it isn't, I mean, I can say for myself, I'm very uncomfortable with qualitative research, although I know that it is so very important and I would love to, but I just don't know how to. And I haven't spent enough time developing that skill set, for instance, or I know that there are certain disciplines within which I am comfortable doing research as compared to others. So I think it's very, very important to know what your strengths are, to know what your philosophical leanings are in terms of how you approach science and how you approach research. So whether you approach it from a very null hypothesis significance testing framework, a very positivist framework, or whether you approach it from a social constructivist framework and say that, no, but there are multiple realities and it is my job to go and sample all of those realities. So I think it's very important to align whatever research you're doing with your own strengths. Another area is, of course, personal insights and hunches. Observations play a very, very important role, at least in the social sciences, because at the end of the day, we're trying to study human behavior. And I mean, if you just pay attention to your surroundings, especially in, say, unfortunately, COVID times, you can come up with a research question regarding, say, vaccine hesitancy in individuals above 60 years of age, despite vaccines being available in India now, etc., which is, I mean, a scientific miracle in itself. 1 year ago today, we had no idea what was happening. So I think observations, especially in the social psychological sciences, can help as sources of research ideas. Serendipity is also a source. I think we shouldn't discount just chance favoring you in terms of you coming up with a research idea. Questioning popular assumptions. So this is actually playing into replication and extension, because popular assumptions are possibly the ones that have been verified in the West and then communicated to us in non-weird nations, as a result of which we may have just taken it for granted that, yes, this is also how it happens here. Whereas something like that is unlikely to, is a good source of a research idea. So for instance, a quick example here is that we recently ran some data on, a study on understanding whether how you frame the message, say for instance that if I wear a mask, I'm protecting myself, versus if I wear a mask, I'm protecting my family. All right, so that's how we manipulated message framing. Whether that would impact future preventive health behaviors in COVID times, because that's been found in Western countries, and that actually feeds into health messaging strategies. But in India, we found that that was not significant at all. Surprisingly, what was significant is moral emotions. So emotions like, I feel shame if I don't wear a mask, and I feel proud if I do wear a mask, and I feel anger towards someone who doesn't wear a mask, and I feel grateful towards someone who does wear a mask. And it's interesting because health messaging strategies are pretty robust as within like individual and collectivistic cultures, etc. But I think questioning that basic assumption is another source of a research idea. You could be surprised with what you find. Practical problems, of course, implications, real world implications of your research, ideas that help explain paradoxes, such as the one that I just described. Adding context to current work, as I said, replicating something that has been found in the West, but within the Indian cultural context. And then finally, a big source is actually themes or topics given by funding bodies or agencies themselves. So I know that the major minor grant doesn't necessarily restrict you to a specific theme or a topic, but of course there are other funding bodies that say that, okay, this is a research area on the science of honesty, or this is a research area on the science of well-being and things like that. And then you have to brainstorm and think about a research study that can align within a larger framework, a larger topic. And I think in general, me included, we're sometimes really hard on ourselves when we come up with an idea and we really don't know whether it may work or not. So when you're generating your own idea, one is, as I said, be comfortable within the skill set that you have, as well as within the sub-discipline that you're looking at for generating the idea. So select an area within your discipline. Look for gaps in your area based on what was communicated on the earlier slide, based on your intuition or theory or both. Step 3 is the worst, because that's when you go on to Google Scholar and type in the keywords that you think you've come up with for a brand new idea, and see that like papers from the 1980s have already answered those research questions. But again, I think it's very important to note whether you are doing that in a different context, whether you are doing that with a different population, whether you are trying to answer the same question. As I said, a replication and an extension are also very valid areas of research. So I think it's important to remember that someone may not have done the exact same thing that you're thinking about doing. I mean, it is rare. And then check whether that idea will have any theoretical, academic, practical applications. These are very, very important when you're building your research proposal, because at the end of the day, you can do basic research, which is purely theoretical. So building a theoretical model, for instance, and you can do applied research, which has real world implications, impact. So for instance, the health messaging strategies. And I think it's important right at the get-go to think about what these implications and applications could be, especially when you're coming up with a grant proposal, because this is a very important selling point of your research. So ideally, the turnover of converting your research results into something tangible that can benefit society needs to be quick. Ideally. And step 5 is start writing your research proposal. Easier said than done. But when you come up, after all of this, after the brainstorming and the sources of research ideas, when you eventually come up with a potential research idea, you do need to check one, whether it's feasible. So do you have the resources at your disposal to do it? There have been several times that we've written grant applications that have not been successful, and we have still managed to, with pulling resources together, do that project. So I think it's also really important to know whether what you are doing is feasible with or without the grant. Like, how much is the grant going to really contribute to you actually being able to carry out the research? And this is, of course, very, very different for the natural sciences and the physical sciences, because there would be lab work involved in some cases, and you would need materials and you would need chemicals, for instance, so you would need hiring of space and things like that. So you do need to consider whether what you are proposing to do is feasible. Secondly, is it worth doing? Are you reinventing the wheel? Are you looking for, and are you going into the research knowing the answer to your research question, which is not in the best interest of your project or of your research study, because it isn't research if you already know the answer. That's the idea. So you need to ask yourself whether it's worth doing. Do you have the ability to carry it out, and or can you collaborate with others who do have the ability to carry it out? So again, reassessing your own skills, assessing what you're good at, what you're bad at. If you don't know how to create a research budget, can you collaborate with someone who does? Can you collaborate with someone who probably has written a budget earlier? Can you upskill yourself into understanding and learning how to create a research budget, etc.? Is it original? Based on my introduction, you know that I'm a creativity researcher. So this is the most important criterion for me. Is the research original? Is the research potentially going to make an original and novel contribution to the field in which you are working. And I think it's important to remember that changes or, well, findings in research are incremental and they build on each other. So we're not going to say that you're going to do a study that's going to cure cancer, but you are definitely going to do something that may move closer in that direction. Standing on the shoulders of giants is what I truly believe in, and research is incremental. However, that incremental change, that incremental delta also needs to be original. The next one is whether it's too broad or too narrow. We need to reassess and find that Goldilocks spot for our research design, as well as our implications, as well as how we want to plan to conduct the study. Is it really broad? Are the questions really broad? Are they really super specific? We need to find a balance between the two of them. And will it have impact? This is a very loaded question because sometimes researchers equate it with, will I get citations out of this? Versus it's kind of the difference between statistical significance and practical significance. So statistical significance is your standard p less than 0.05 if you're a quantitative researcher. Practical significance is whether that actually means something or not. And will it have impact is kind of the same thing. Will it actually mean something for research, for your field, for science, if you do this study or not? And coming to misconceptions, I think an important one is that you need an absolutely fantastic idea. Like you can't do research without like a groundbreaking, path-breaking idea. As I said, it is incremental advancements that move research and science forward. You do not need a fantastic idea, you just need an idea. And others' ideas are better than yours. It may be true, but it should not hinder you from doing the research that you do want to do. I would say that the quality of ideas can be different. However, their worth may not be in that sense. Another person may just have different skills, different interests to do different things as compared to what you plan to do. Another misconception is that it has to be something, the idea has to be something that you are 100% going to find. You're not. As I said, if you go into a research study thinking that you know the idea, know the answer to a question, it doesn't constitute research. It constitutes you learning how to do research. I remember in my third year practicals, we had the Stroop task, and went in knowing that, yes, this is the result that we're going to find. We're not reinventing, we are reinventing the wheel in a sense, and well, the wheel turns and that's absolutely fine. So, but that's very different when you're learning how to do research, when you're learning how to do, how to play by the rules, so to speak. But eventually when you do research, you cannot guarantee that you're going to find what you set out to find. Replication is the best form of flattery. I know a lot of students who actually do this, but again, replicating someone else's design in this context may be useful as long as you add in probably other variables that are more context specific, that can add more weight and more value to your replication design. So replication is not bad. However, if you do it to the T, it may not be adding worth or value to the study or to the research area. Cultural context can be ignored. It absolutely 100% cannot. We are very, very cognizant of making sure that the generalizability of our results is described really well, is is described cautiously, more importantly. So especially in COVID times, because we've been conducting research studies online and passing around surveys online, we know that the results generated from those studies can only be generalized to other netizens in India, not and probably English speaking netizens in India, and not really to a larger context. So I think it's very important in human participants research to know what can be ignored and what can't. I suppose in the natural sciences, cultural context can be ignored. So this is more pertaining to social science research. So coming to the structure, the basic structure of a research proposal, what we usually start out with is a working title. So a working title could be something like what are the determinants of vaccine hesitancy amongst senior citizens in India or in Mumbai? A working title can be a question. It can be your research question. A working title can be a statement. The determinants of vaccine hesitancy among senior citizens in India. Or it can be a two-part title, etc. So a working title just helps you describe exactly what your research is, followed by you then come to your research question. And this is a really important part of your research proposal. So again, as if you are doing like a quantitative study, then you are going to also have hypotheses. However, if you are only doing a qualitative study, you would just have research questions. Research questions are questions. They end with a question mark. And they are not sentences, they are not statements. Those are purposes or problems. So to understand la la la, or to examine the effects of XYZ, those are like your objectives actually. Like under your research questions come your objectives. So to assess, to study, to examine, etc., etc. Your rationale is where you put in why, and you put in why now. So why is it important to study what you are studying? And why isn't it important right now? What is happening in the world, or what is happening in your field or in your discipline or in your research area, that it is important to study what you are proposing to study right now? What will happen if you don't study it right now, etc. So a rationale is the need as well as the significance of your research, taking into account the current background, not just physical background, but the background within your field, within the literature, within the scholarship that already exists. The other part of another part of the research proposal is your literature review. As I said, this is normally slightly brief, but again, a good literature review in your proposal goes a very long way. I have had times when I have literally just copied a chunk of my literature review and put it from my proposal and put it in my final manuscript with no edits, which is actually really, really useful. So write the literature review even in your proposal with just standard academic writing principles, no plagiarism, cite it properly, all of that, so that the effort and the time that you put in creating your literature review in your proposal can actually offset future time costs for when you're writing your manuscript. So that's kind of setting the stage with your research questions, maybe hypotheses, rationale, objectives, and your literature review. And a research proposal, like a research paper, follows an hourglass approach. So it starts out really broad, and then it gets narrower in the middle. That's your method. And then it ends really broad, because that's going to be your implications and applications and overall significance of your study. So we've come to the middle section right now. That's the methodology, and that's basically, this is the most original part of your proposal, and in the future your paper as well. So the methodology is what you're going to do. I have given components within the methodology as would be standard within any quantitative or qualitative research paper in the social sciences. So you would have certain measures, you would have participants, where you're going to recruit the participants from. You would have an overall design. So if it is an experiment, you would put down the kind of design that you're proposing, and then you would have your overall procedure. Now, even when you are conducting, say, a survey research, you would have to put down what kind of design you're following, as well as the procedure, as well as whether, like nitty-gritty details, like are the measures counterbalanced, are they randomized, all of that. So you do need to put in all of these basic details. And of course, if you're working in the natural sciences, you will put down the design of your experiment, as well as materials that you would be handling, and in addition to the hypotheses that you have. That's the middle section, or the methodology. And then, as I said, because this is a proposal, we're going to propose the analysis that we're going to do. And one of the ways that I like to structure research proposals is literally having one analysis plan, like a sentence or a paragraph, corresponding to each research question or hypothesis. So you have an idea of exactly what you are going to do with the data, and how it is going to help you answer that research question or test that hypothesis. So there is a one-to-one correspondence, or it is ideal if there is a one-to-one correspondence between your proposed analysis and the research question or hypothesis. The next bits about the research proposal are any ethics related information. So whether you are going to apply for ethics approval, whether this study involves secondary data that may not need ethics approval, etc., etc. Like the ethics information that you have to put into a research proposal varies according to the university institution that you belong to, as well as the requirements by a potential funder as well. Next, we always put down limitations, because as researchers, I think it's very important for us to know what we're not going to be able to do as well. Because there is a grand plan about the proposal and what we're proposing to do in the research, but there are definitely going to be limitations for every study, every design, and it's important to acknowledge those here. You also write down applications, as I said, theoretical, academic, practical, as well as overall significance. So this is where we're ending broad. And you include references, appendices. So that's your research proposal. Those are the main components of your research proposal. And just like in a train, the extra bogie of a grant proposal involves time scale. So that's a Gantt chart that I'm going to show you on the next slide. It involves a budget, which I'm going to describe how efficiently we can prepare. Importantly, it includes applicant-related information. So information about yourself and about your own credentials and about why you should be the person doing the research. So remember, in the rationale, I said why and why now. The grant proposal also requires why you. So you need to be able to communicate to a potential funder that I am the best person to do this study, do this research because of XYZ that I have done in the past, or XYZ that I'm going to do in the future by receiving this grant. And the location of the research is also required when you're writing a grant proposal, primarily if you're say if your research involves travel, or it involves face-to-face interviews, and because travel and things like that would add on to your budget, and therefore you would have to put down what the location of your research study is. So this is what a Gantt chart looks like. That's GANTT, where we basically try and put down large activities or large, say, milestones in the first column. And this is a week-wise Gantt chart. So it's for 24 weeks, a project for 6 months. And we have major activities such as ethical approval. We need to do the literature review, survey design, do a pilot test, do some data collection and data validation, data analysis, diagnostic statistics. So that's mostly your cleaning as well as descriptive statistics, data analysis, predictive modeling, that's your inferential statistics, feedback and revisions, and final report. Now, this, of course, is a Gantt chart that you can understand this is from one of our projects for that we applied for funding. So you can understand that they typically do not require a vast amount of detail. Actually, this varies. There have been grants where they require a week by week paragraph about what exactly you're going to do across 2 years. That was a very tedious grant to write. The other one, there are others that just require like a broad Gantt chart like this. So it does vary quite a bit, but it's always useful to know as in terms of a snapshot what exactly is going to be happening at what point in time of your research study. So I would definitely encourage you trying to create this for ongoing projects or ongoing work as well. Very, very simple to create and very useful. Right. So moving into similarities and differences. So as you can see, the major similarity is that a large chunk of your research proposal is kind of subsumed within your grant proposal. However, a grant proposal has a different goal. It isn't as noble as a research proposal, where the goal is to conduct good research. A grant proposal's goal is to get the money. And not that it influences the way you write your research questions or your research design, but obviously the structure and content need to reflect that, listen, I'm the right person for this, and you need to sell yourself a little more, I suppose. And the emphasis in a grant proposal is definitely on costs and timeline. It is on research motivation as well, but mostly costs and timeline and personnel. So the people who are actually going to be doing the research, very, very important in a grant proposal. So in terms of preparing a budget, and I think this is quite important, and this is one of the areas that I learned last and very reluctantly as a researcher, because as a researcher you're not used to doing this. You're not trained. You don't know how to. You don't know why you need to do this. Like, shouldn't there be some administrative person helping you do this? Turns out every researcher should know how to create a budget and should not kind of shy away from putting time costs as they are due towards you when you're writing out a budget. So importantly, when you are preparing a budget, I think major heads are say personnel or travel or your main research activity. There would be overheads or contingency that your that your institution is going to take care of, but largely it's people costs that are time costs, and there are work costs and travel costs. So when you're thinking about the work costs, you identify the key research activity that you are going to be undertaking as part of your research. Obviously, if your research involves fieldwork versus if it is a survey to be circulated online, your budget is going to have to reflect that. Usually with every line item in a budget, you also put down a budget justification. So for instance, say for instance, you need to account for travel costs, ex-Mumbai to Delhi flights, all right? And you need to put down a figure for 2 flights per month for 2 months. So that's 4 flights, all right? You do have to put down a link of the lowest cost carrier that you have gotten that cost estimate from. If you find that it is 5,000 per flight, then you have to put down that link and say that this cost estimate was derived as on so and so date, so that there's a budget justification for every line item that you are putting in your budget. So as I said, it really depends on what your key research activity is. If it's intense lab work and you need certain access to certain chemicals or materials, etc., you would have to put that into your budget. That's your key research activity. Similarly, in human participants research, if it is field work, if it is interviews, if it is quantitative surveys, but actually requires face-to-face data collection, then those are your key research activities. Data analysis, as I said, when you're budgeting for personnel, budget for yourself, obviously, but also you'll have to budget for the team who's going to work with you on that project. So usually personnel costs are written in terms of like a percentage of time that you are going to give toward the project for X number of months. So for instance, if the based on the earlier Gantt chart, the project was for 6 months, if I were to budget for myself, I would put down personnel, I would put down my name, and I would say 50% of time for 6 months and give that figure into 6, basically. So because I'm not going to be doing only that, and that's a given, especially when you're a researcher, a consultant, a psychologist, a scientist, whatever it is. Everybody knows no one does only research in academia. Most of the time you're teaching. So there is going to be a percentage of your time that is going to be contributed towards research, and that's the time cost that you're budgeting for. When you're preparing a budget, also identify gaps in existing tools and skills. So for instance, when you're budgeting, if you do not have access to a proprietary software that you need to be able to analyze your data or to collect data, budget that in. That's your materials cost, for instance. So if you do not, or if you need to upskill yourself by going to X workshop and you need the grant to cover your costs of being able to attend that workshop, budget that in. So identify what gaps exist right now and budget for that within the grant. The bare essentials are required to be accounted for. I think it's important, as I said, personnel, work, and materials. I think those are that's the bare minimum that you need to account for. Plan for contingencies, as I said, that so the overheads towards your university or your institute are not necessarily contingencies that you're going to get for your project. So based on every university's requirements, rules, etc., that overheads for the university ranges between 15 and 20%. But that goes to the university. That won't come to you as a researcher. So if you need to plan for contingency, like a fund for yourself, if you think there may be overspending on certain heads, then you add in contingencies as a percentage before the overheads as well. The perils of overestimation are, of course, that you may be hitting the upper limit of what the funder is able to is able to give, as a result of which it's always a good idea to ask for like less, but not much less. Ask for a reasonable amount within the scope of that grant. Another area that's very, very important in a grant proposal is what will happen once your research is done. So it isn't enough to just say that you're going to get a publication out of this research, because a funder requires a clear understanding of what are going to be the outputs and the outcomes. And this is slightly different. So the outputs are very tangible. They are, as I said, as you can see, they are publications, working papers, posters, policy briefs, newspaper, popular press articles, things like that. Whereas outcomes are what's going to happen to the field or to the discipline as a result of you having done this research. What are the broader implications of you having done this research on the discipline at large, so to speak? And funders are very, very, funders stress on this very, very much, because the fact that you're getting your research funded does not necessarily mean that all you're going to get out of it is a publication and good for us. It does need to be broader impacts as well as outcomes for your discipline and science at large. Policy impacts can also be discussed. I think they should also be discussed, especially for social science policies. Human behavioral policies, etc., or policies that pertain to human behavior. That's an important area for the social sciences, but also putting down strategies for engaging with potential stakeholders. So if you're working on a project that requires some kind of government support, then coming full circle at the end of your project and saying that, okay, I'm going to do a workshop, or I'm going to do a policy convention or a policy conference where I'm going to invite my government stakeholders and disseminate the findings of my research, for instance. So I think the chief difference between a research proposal and a grant proposal is that the research cycle doesn't end when you publish. In a grant proposal, when you're pursuing a grant, you need to disseminate, you need to go full circle, you need to communicate back to your stakeholders who actually gave you that money, because that would just help generate more impact of your research, I suppose. Some sources of research support can be, say, institutional or in-house funding based on whether your university or your college has those policies. They can also be, if you approach not-for-profit or professional organizations that have, say, CSR funding for conducting research, or whether they're willing to give you any kind of funding in that sense to do research. There are several foundations that are also non-profit that do provide funds and grants for research. Industry, and looking at academia industry collaborations, wherein you are able to give to that specific industry, for instance, some kind of research insights into their processes or into behavior or various other facets of within the industry, of what happens within that industry from a research perspective, and government grants. So the UGC major and minor grant obviously falls within government grants because you are eligible to apply for those. And the process for making these applications, it's slightly different across different agencies, across different funders. So importantly, the first thing is to build technical and management skills. So if your university or your institution does not have, say, a grant management department, or does not have individuals who have already applied to grants, been successful at receiving grants or unsuccessful, etc., If you can't interact with those people, then start looking for collaborators who can. Start looking for people who have worked through this grant cycle or do have those technical management skills that you can first work with and then learn from those individuals. When you're selecting funding agencies, remember that some, as I said, some funding agencies may have a certain topic or an area that they need you to do research on. If your interests do not align with that, do not apply to that agency. You would be spending a lot of time writing your proposal to no end. But gather the relevant information on selected agencies. So know whether you are eligible to apply to that agency or not. As professors at St. Xavier's, of course, you would be eligible to apply to all government bodies in India for funding. So I think it's just important to remember what your eligibility status is. Write in the appropriate format. All grant agencies have their own format. I know that the UGC system has an online portal where you need to fill in different sections of your proposal, the budget, etc. So write in the appropriate format, educate yourselves about what that format is across different agencies. And then what happens is that your proposal goes for peer review, just like a research paper. Your proposal will be sent for peer review, and sometimes you would just get a yes or a no response without really feedback on your proposal, which is pretty frustrating because you don't know what you did right or you don't know what you did wrong. I mean, of course, if you didn't get the grant, you did something wrong, but you don't know what you did wrong, which is why it's pretty funny. I mean, there are several comics and memes online that say that like grant funding is as good as a lottery. Like you have no idea who's actually going to get it or not. But I still have a slightly more optimistic approach. And I think you should too. So it isn't all that bad. In most cases, just be prepared that you won't get good feedback in terms of why a proposal didn't make it through. And of course, examples of government agencies where you can apply to are the UGC, ICSSR for social science research, and DST, DBT for hard sciences and the natural sciences. Great, that's what I had actually. So very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Hansika. I think we can stop the share screen, or if you'd like to keep the contacts there. People are actually saying it was an extremely extremely clear kind of structured presentation. So thank you so much for that. And they were asking whether the PPT could be shared, but I'd like to clarify that since this is a YouTube live kind of session, it will be recorded anyway on YouTube. And if it's okay with you, it stays on our college YouTube channel. So the people who were here obviously can go back and look at it and revise whatever it is you have very clearly pointed out, the whole structure, and maybe even look at the cartoons once again to find out what was funny there. Okay, there were a couple of things that came up. I think let's just run through what people have asked for, and then maybe even if there's time, have a quick discussion as well. One of the early questions was about the kind of hypothesis. Is it necessary to provide alternate hypotheses when the proposal is being framed as a null hypothesis? Do you want to clarify something about that maybe first, and then we can carry on?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And in terms of when you're writing your research proposal, so typically the norm is not to include an H0 and an H1. You usually just include your alternate hypothesis. So I know that we've been trained to include the null and the alternate when we're learning, but again, that's when we're learning. When we actually do research, well, in real life, so to speak, you include just the alternate.
Okay. So that was a simple answer there. Yeah. There was one person who, with a question mark, has asked negative creativity. Would you like to share some of your insights on that? It's not necessarily linked to your theme, but it's your passion. So, and it's been asked.
Sure. Thank you for that as well. So, negative creativity is, as I said, it took me 4 years to come up with that elevator pitch of is how people get good ideas to do bad things. And it essentially throughout my PhD and even in my postdoc, what I was studying are what are the contextual influences as well as personality level indicators of people who are negatively creative or who have a predisposition towards kind of bending the rules but in a creative way. And what I found was that there is a cluster of personality traits known as the dark triad, which are dark personality traits. So psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism. Individuals who exhibited those traits more strongly were more likely to be negatively creative. Another important distinction rather between like positive and negative forms of creativity was actually the use of deception. So people who, in most cases than not, negative creative acts involve some form of deception, either omission or commission, um, to that enhances that level of creativity. And the third insight from my work has been that individuals are also like people who are anyway prone to bending the rules a little bit are more likely to do that when the instructions are ambiguous. So when the instructions are not clear cut and when they find themselves in a morally ambiguous situation, and they have that proclivity to be negative, they're more likely to be negative.
Very interesting. One of our participants has asked whether you could help by pointing us in the right direction to specific funding agencies. I know you listed a couple generally, but would you like to elaborate?
Sure. I mean, again, I would love to know from the person who's added the comment where you are in your like which discipline you belong to or where you are in your academic trajectory and things like that. Because unfortunately, there isn't a website that I can direct you to for all funding agencies. And the ones at least in India that do, those are the three major ones, honestly, that fund most of the scientific research projects in India, both in the social sciences as well as otherwise. There is ICMR. I didn't list the Indian Council of Medical Research, but that also exists. And then, of course, there are several agencies abroad, but there's a whole other that's a whole other ballgame about how to apply and whether you're eligible or not. So I mean, I would love to connect with this individual offline possibly.
Maybe they can email or something like that if you want to. I hope they got the email. But once again, once we finish, we can put that up once more before we end. All right. So that's another thing I'd like to vouch for. If you do have some wish to collaborate, then Hansika is available, and she is one of the most prompt people who responds when you ask for clarifications. All right. So go ahead and reach out. Right. One more question has come about, I'll just read it here. I was wondering what is the exact difference in the peer review process when it comes to peer-reviewed journals and peer-reviewed proposals?
Sure, great question. So as I was mentioning, when your grant proposal is submitted and someone has to evaluate whether they should give you the money or not. So there's a set of academic peers that reviews your proposal for feasibility, for cost effectiveness, for the novelty of your research design, etc. And on the basis of those factors that you may not necessarily know what those criteria are. They may not be transparent to you. In some cases they are. They would make a decision and tell you sorry or tell you congratulations. But you don't usually get more feedback unless you make the shortlist to the next round. If you get rejected, I mean, if your proposal gets rejected, then it gets rejected with no real feedback. Whereas in like the peer review process for journal articles, for manuscripts rather, what happens is that when you submit your paper, your manuscript to a journal, one of two things can happen. It can either get what we term desk rejected. So basically the editor refuses to even send out your manuscript for further reviews and returns that manuscript to you and says that, no, please try another journal. In the second case, the manuscript actually does go for peer review and then comes back with 2 to 3 independent reviews. Usually they should be double blind, so you won't know who reviewed your paper and they won't know who wrote the article. And it'll be, you'll get reviews about how to improve that manuscript. Now, even if you do get peer reviews, that doesn't mean that your article has been accepted. I know it sounds really terrible, but sometimes it does. And then you get to revise your manuscript on the basis of those reviews and resubmit it, and then it gets published. But not all the time.
Okay. The person who you were asking about, who asked about the funding agencies, I think is from the management faculty. He's put up something in the chat there. Any agencies for management faculty members to acquire funding. But I assume he will also reach out to you. Okay, just a couple more. One more question I think came up regarding your project itself. And the question was, how did you find responders for your project on negative creativity? Let me add very creative and innovative. All right. So if you'd like to answer that, that's one. And the other one addresses a kind of, I think, an issue related to proposals and budgets and grants that most of us seem to find really difficult to grapple with, and that is all the documentation. The kind of, it's really difficult to find the right kind of agency and then to put in that time and effort in the right format along with all the other things that one is juggling. So I don't know whether you have any other insights on that, but yes, we agree it is difficult, no question about that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, for my negative creativity studies, I did my PhD at IIT Bombay, so all my sample is from there. So, I mean, it's they were from all over India, and they were some of the brightest minds, but some of the most devious minds as well. And in terms of the latter, yes, it is so very difficult. It is so very time consuming. There was a grant that I co-wrote with collaborators in the UK for the UK Research Innovation Grant to study how creativity can be a buffer against COVID-19 anxieties and loneliness. Because through creativity, you can find meaning and make meaning in your daily life, etc. And it was a great grant. We spent 4 months on writing it and doing the budgeting and all of that, and it didn't come through. And this is not the first time that this has happened. So I think it's kind of, but in our defense, now we have this great proposal that we can then apply to another agency with, which means that it's a one-time investment if you look at it in that way. But again, I completely understand that the paperwork and the documentation is absolutely killing, but I think that's that would be the case in any way if someone is giving you a bunch of money to do something that you want to do. So I think it comes with it unfortunately comes with the deal.
Right. Along with all the deadlines and the timeline that goes with it. There's this rush to try and get it done in the correct way, not just efficiently, but effectively, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think, are there any other questions? Let me just clarify with my team here, Vidita and Suvaiba, or we can wind up now. Yeah, we are near the end. So, okay. I'm going to invite our colleague Suvaiba to give you, on behalf of us, a vote of thanks. Go ahead, Suvaiba.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ruby ma'am. It is a great pleasure for me to deliver a vote of thanks for this event to all the assembled here virtually. I would like to thank our resource person, Ms. Hansika Kapoor, who shared her thoughts on writing a research and grant proposal. Ma'am, it was a very great talk, explaining the importance of research proposal, its format, highlighting the difference between research proposal and research paper. You really gave us interesting examples. And the code, if you are doing a research and if you know the answer, then that isn't a research. And you just need an idea. It need not be a fantastic idea. Was a great way of explaining. Ma'am, you gave us deep understanding on the basic research structure, on the proposal, on Gantt Chart, and also great understanding on the budget proposal and the various fund agencies. Ma'am, we had a great session with you and a lot of takeaway from you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, our management, our FDP team who has organized this fruitful session. I would like to thank all our participants who are listening patiently throughout both the sessions. And lastly, I would like to thank our coordinating team for today, Ms. Ruby ma'am, Brother Vivian, Vidita, and Annie. So I thank you everyone. On this note, I would like to end my vote of thanks. The feedback form link is being shared with the YouTube. So kindly fill in shortly. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thank
Subhaiba.
you.
By the way, just as we were winding up, there was something in the chat box that said, do you have an opinion on ghost writing? Well, we've said our thank you anyway, but if you do have an opinion, we do have a minute or so, or we can just wind up.
Sure. I think it's fantastic for novels, but horrible for science.
All right, that's a good note. Absolutely the correct, I would say, tone to take with that. Thank you so much, Hansika. It's been a pleasure and extremely informative, insightful, and so well structured.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Subhaiba. Now I think we can wind up. We have put the feedback link. Please make sure that you do send in your feedback. It'll be live for another 5-10 minutes here, and the feedback form itself will be open for about an hour or so after this. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow for the remainder of the sessions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, ma'am.